My name is Elena Voss, and I was 36 years old the morning my stepmother stood up in front of every relative we had and announced that my father had left her everything, the $80 million estate, the sprawling lakefront mansion, the company he built from nothing. Then she looked straight at my brother and me and said, with the calmest voice you've ever heard, "It's time for you both to leave. This is my home now." I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just smiled, a small, quiet smile that made her perfect eyebrows pull together for half a second, because in that moment I knew something she didn't. Something my father had protected in silence for 11 years, something no amount of locked doors, forged papers, or expensive lawyers could ever touch. Welcome back to stories that remind us the quiet ones usually win. If you've ever been erased from your own family or felt like an outsider in the house you grew up in, stay with me. This one might hurt a little, but it ends with something better than revenge. It ends with peace, and if you're the kind of person who believes paperwork can speak louder than any scream, type the word trust right now in the comments. Let me know I'm not alone here. Let me take you back to that morning. The grandfather clock in the foyer, the one my father wound by hand every Sunday for 30 years, was striking 11 when Vanessa tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sound cut through the low murmurs of black suits and whispered condolences like a knife. Everyone turned. She stood at the bottom of the wide oak staircase in a dove-gray dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, one hand resting on the banister where my father used to hang his old leather jacket. She thanked everyone for coming. She spoke about devotion, about being the one who stayed until the very end. Her voice was soft, practiced, the kind of voice people trust without thinking. Then she looked across the room, found my eyes, and said the words that changed everything. As many of you know, Richard and I built this life together, and he made sure the woman who stood by him would be taken care of. The house, the estate, it's all mine now. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some heads nodded in sympathy. A few of my distant cousins glanced at us with that familiar mix of pity and judgment. My younger brother Marcus went rigid beside me. I felt his hand clench into a fist, but I gently pressed my fingers on his wrist, our old signal from childhood. Not yet. Vanessa continued, her tone dropping into that gentle, poisonous sweetness. "I think it would be best if you two collected yourselves and left. This isn't easy for any of us." The new brass lock on the side door, the family door I'd used my whole life, suddenly made perfect sense. They'd changed the locks before they even buried him. I stood up slowly. The room went quiet enough to hear the ice shifting in someone's untouched drink. I looked at Vanessa, at the woman who had spent the last 4 months treating us like unwelcome guests in our own father's house, and I laughed, just once, soft, almost under my breath. But it carried. Her composure cracked for the briefest moment. That was the first time I saw real uncertainty in her eyes. If you've ever been locked out, not just from a house, but from someone you love while they're slipping away, you know exactly how heavy that moment feels in your chest. I had spent months calling, driving, begging for just 5 minutes with my father, and now here we were, being escorted out of his funeral reception like strangers. But here's what Vanessa never understood. I wasn't laughing because I was broken. I was laughing because she had just made the biggest mistake of her life in front of 40 witnesses. She had bet everything on a will she clearly never fully understood, and I had spent my entire adult life learning one lesson my father drilled into me since I was a little girl. Paperwork doesn't lie, and the right documents filed at the right time can outlast any lie. As Marcus and I walked out that front door into the cold January air, gravel crunching under our shoes, he turned to me, voice shaking with grief and rage. "Elena, what the hell was that? She just stole everything." I looked back at the mansion my father built. The one with the long driveway lined with old maples, the one that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and old books if you knew where to stand. I put my hand on my brother's shoulder and said the first calm thing I'd said in months. "She didn't steal anything, Marcus. She just announced her loss in public. Now we go get the proof." That was the moment everything shifted, not with shouting, not with tears, but with the quiet certainty that comes when you finally understand the game you've been forced to play, and you realize you've been holding the winning cards the whole time. If this already has you leaning in, stay with me, because to understand how we got here, I need to tell you about my father, about the woman he married 6 years ago, and about the slow, calculated way fear can turn someone you thought you knew into a stranger. This story isn't just about losing a house. It's about what happens when someone tries to erase you from your own family, and what it takes to quietly, calmly write yourself back in. I'll see you in the next part. To really understand why that small laugh left my stepmother so unsettled, You have to know who my father was and the kind of home he built long before Vanessa ever stepped foot inside it. My name is Elena Voss, and I grew up in the kind of house that felt more like a story than a building. My father, Richard Voss, started with one battered pickup truck and a warehouse the size of a garage. 40 years later, he had built Voss Supply Solutions into a regional powerhouse, everything from industrial sensors to custom logistics software. But money was never what defined him. What defined him was the way he measured twice and cut once, in business and in life. I was 12 when my mother passed away from a sudden heart condition. The house went quiet after that. Dad didn't fall apart in front of us. Instead, he taught my younger brother Marcus and me how to keep moving forward. Every Saturday morning, we'd sit at the big oak table in the kitchen while he made pancakes, and he'd say the same thing. The world will try to take things from you. Don't make it easy by forgetting who you are. He kept every important paper in his study, the room that always smelled of old books, faint pipe tobacco, and the cedar chest he brought back from one of his early business trips. I used to sit on the floor there for hours, watching him organize files with the same care other fathers used to fix cars. That's where I learned my obsession with documentation. While other girls my age were collecting stickers, I was helping Dad label tax folders and warranty cards. He'd ruffle my hair and say, "You're going to be the one who keeps this family story straight, Elena. Never lose that." If you've ever lost a parent young, you know how those small rituals become anchors. The way Dad would wind the grandfather clock every Sunday. The way he kept my mother's favorite teacup on the shelf, even though none of us drank tea. Those little things held us together when the big things felt impossible. I followed in his disciplined footsteps. After college, I joined the Army as an intelligence analyst. 8 years of tracking patterns, reading between the lines, and learning that the smallest detail can change everything. When I got out, I started my own consulting firm, helping companies spot risks before they become disasters. Funny how life prepares you for battles you don't see coming. Marcus took a different path. He became a high school shop teacher, just 30 minutes from the lake house. He has our father's hands, steady, patient, and he coaches wrestling on the side. The two of us were close in that quiet, reliable way that doesn't need daily phone calls. We both showed up for Dad, even when life got busy. For years after Mom died, Dad seemed content being alone. He'd say the house was already full with memories. Then, 6 years ago, he met Vanessa at a charity gala for veterans. She was warm, attentive, and quick with a laugh that made his eyes crinkle. At first, I was genuinely happy for him. He was 64, still sharp as ever, but the big house had started to feel too quiet. Vanessa had a daughter, Sophia, a few years younger than Marcus. They moved in, and for a while the house felt alive again. Sunday dinners, laughter echoing off the tall ceilings, fresh flowers on the table. I remember the first time Vanessa complimented my father's record-keeping habit. She said it was charming, old-fashioned. She even offered to help organize things. I didn't think much of it then. Why would I? She seemed grateful to have found stability after what Dad quietly told me was a difficult past. 2 failed marriages, financial struggles, the kind of instability that leaves scars. Looking back now, I can see the first small shifts. How my number slowly moved down in Dad's phone. How visits started needing to be scheduled through her. How she'd gently steer conversations away whenever we asked about his health. But at the time, I told myself I was being protective, maybe even jealous of someone new taking Mom's place in small ways. I wish I had trusted my instincts sooner. My father used to say a house isn't made of bricks, it's made of the people who remember what matters. He taught me that the best protection isn't loud security systems or fancy lawyers. It's making sure the truth is written down, filed properly, and impossible to erase. That lesson would save us, but first, we had to lose almost everything. If you've ever watched someone you love slowly get pulled away by a new person in their life, you know how confusing and painful it feels. You question yourself. You wonder if you're overreacting. You stay polite because that's what responsible daughters do. I stayed polite for too long. And that's how the doors started closing. The first 2 years after Vanessa moved in were almost peaceful. I want to be honest with you, I didn't hate her at the beginning. In fact, part of me was relieved. My father had carried the weight of that big lake house alone for so long. Watching him smile again at the dinner table, hearing him laugh at her quick jokes about his stubborn habits, it felt like the house was finally breathing again. Vanessa was elegant, always put together, with a soft southern accent that made everything she said sound thoughtful. Her daughter Sophia was quiet, polite, and seemed genuinely grateful to have a stable home after years of moving around. They both called my father Richard, with such warmth that it was hard not to root for them. During holidays, Vanessa would cook these elaborate meals and insist on including all of Mom's old recipes. She'd say things like, "I want to honor what was already here." It sounded sincere. If you've ever wanted your widowed parent to find happiness again, you know that complicated mix of joy and quiet protectiveness. I felt it deeply. I even helped her redecorate the sunroom so it felt less like a memorial and more like a living space. Marcus would come over after school events and play cards with Dad and Sophia. For a while, it felt like we were building something new, not replacing what we lost but adding to it. But fear has a way of showing up in small moments. I started noticing how Vanessa gradually positioned herself as the gatekeeper. At first, it was little things. She'd answer Dad's phone when I called, saying he was resting or in the middle of something important. She offered to manage his schedule because he works too hard even in retirement. Then she took over sorting his mail and gently suggested she handle the household finances to ease his burden. One evening, during a quiet dinner, Dad mentioned something offhand about Vanessa's past. He said her previous marriages had ended badly, one with a business that collapsed, leaving her with heavy debts. He spoke about it with kindness, the way he always did, but I saw something flicker in her eyes, a shadow. The kind of look someone gets when they've watched their world crumble and swore it would never happen again. That fear would slowly change everything. By the third year, the shifts became harder to ignore. My weekly calls with Dad started getting shorter. Vanessa would hover nearby, reminding him he needed rest. When I drove up for visits, she'd meet me at the door with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, saying Dad had an appointment or wasn't feeling up to company. Marcus got the same treatment. She never outright refused us. She was too smart for that. Instead, she created a gentle wall of excuses that made us feel guilty for pushing. I remember one afternoon sitting in my car in the driveway after being turned away again. I pulled out the small leather notebook I've carried since my army days, the one where I log every important detail, date, time, what was said, who answered. I didn't know why I was doing it then. It just felt like the responsible thing, the thing Dad taught me. If you've ever felt someone slowly rewriting your place in your own family, you know how disorienting it is. You start doubting your own memories. You wonder if you're the problem, too busy, too distant, not grateful enough for the new chapter. Vanessa was incredibly good at painting that picture to the extended family. She'd share stories at gatherings about how she was the one caring for Dad day in and day out. How we were so focused on our own lives, the relatives who only saw the surface started nodding along. The narrative was shifting, quietly and efficiently. My father, though, even as these changes happened, still had moments of clarity. He'd slip me a quiet look across the table or send a short text that said more than words. "Proud of you, kiddo. Keep your records straight." Those small anchors kept me grounded. I had no idea how much I would need them. Because the real storm was coming, the kind of storm that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but with a locked door and a forged signature. And by the time it hit, Vanessa had already spent years making sure the ground was prepared exactly the way she needed it. She wasn't evil in the cartoon way. She was something far more dangerous, a woman who had lost everything before and was determined, at any cost, that it would never happen again. Even if that cost was my father's own children. And that's when the doors truly started closing. The isolation didn't happen overnight. It crept in like fog over the lake, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore once you were standing in the middle of it. By the 4th year of their marriage, Vanessa had become the quiet center of everything in that house. She handled Dad's medications, coordinated his doctor appointments, and slowly took control of his daily routine. At first, it seemed caring. She'd say things like, "Richard needs his rest, Elena. The doctors say stress isn't good for his heart." And because I trusted her, because I wanted to believe she loved him, I stepped back. But my notebook kept filling up. I'd call in the evenings after work. Sometimes the phone would ring twice and go to voicemail. Other times Vanessa would answer with that same soft, concerned voice. "He's having a rough day, sweetheart. Maybe tomorrow?" Marcus got the same responses when he tried to stop by after coaching. Once he drove all the way up only to be met at the gate with a polite smile and an excuse about Dad being in the middle of a nap. I started driving the hour and a half from my place more often. The side door, the one we'd always used as family, had a new security code. When I knocked, it would open just a crack, held by a brass chain. Sophia's face would appear, calm and distant. "Mom says he's not up for visitors right now." The words always landed the same way. Real family doesn't wait until the end to show up. If you've ever been told you're not real family in the house you grew up in, you know how deeply that cuts. It makes you question every memory, every holiday, every time you thought you belonged. My father was still sharp then. I know because I caught glimpses of him through the windows sometimes. Sitting in his study, looking out at the lake. Once, I saw him pick up the phone and start dialing before Vanessa gently took it from his hand. He looked tired, confused for a split second, then the curtain closed. The diagnosis came like a hammer in March. Pancreatic cancer already advanced. The doctors gave him months, not years. For the first few weeks, things felt almost normal. I took time off work and visited twice a week. Marcus came nearly every day he could. We'd sit with Dad in the study, talking about old fishing trips and the business. He'd squeeze my hand and say, "You always kept the important things straight, Elena. Don't stop now." Then the rules changed. First it was visiting hours. Then a printed letter appeared taped to the side door, supposedly from the oncologist, saying visitors needed to be limited for Dad's immune system. Marcus was turned away at the gate twice. I got the chain on the door. When I called the doctor's office to verify, they sounded surprised, but Vanessa was the legal spouse. She controlled access. Hospice wouldn't override her. One afternoon, I caught the hospice nurse, a kind woman named Claire, by her car at the end of the driveway. She looked over her shoulder before speaking. "Your father asks about you two every single day," she whispered. "His mind is still clear most of the time." Those words hit me harder than anything. If he was asking for us, who was deciding we couldn't see him? I kept logging everything, every missed call, every excuse, every time the door stayed shut. My army training taught me that patterns reveal the truth. And the pattern was clear. Vanessa was building a wall, brick by careful brick. My father managed to send one last envelope before he became too weak. Inside was a short note in his familiar handwriting. "Keep doing what you do best, kiddo. The quiet work matters." Tucked with it was his old Army Challenge coin, the one he carried for decades. I sat in my truck holding it until the windows fogged up. I didn't fully understand the message then. I thought it was just love. I didn't realize it was a map. If you've ever been kept from someone you love while they're slipping away, you know the special kind of helplessness that settles in your bones. You blame yourself. You wonder if you should have fought harder, called louder, shown up unannounced. I carried that guilt like a stone in my chest for months. Vanessa wasn't loud about any of it. She was strategic. She comforted the relatives, shared carefully worded updates on social media, always painting herself as the devoted wife sacrificing everything. The story took hold. We became the children who were too busy or had moved on. By the time January came and Dad passed at 4 a.m., Vanessa had already chosen the funeral home, the casket, and the date. She called me hours later, with the calm efficiency of someone confirming a dinner reservation. The real storm was waiting at the funeral. But by then, I had already started connecting the dots: the notebook, the note, the coin, the patterns I'd been logging for months. I didn't know the full truth yet, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to end the way she planned. The final months of my father's life became a masterclass in quiet control. Vanessa didn't raise her voice or slam doors. She simply made it impossible for us to reach him. After the diagnosis, the walls went up faster than I could have imagined. The typed letter on the side door, signed with what I later learned was a forged doctor's signature, became permanent. For patient safety, all visits must be pre-approved and limited. Hospice workers followed her instructions because she was the spouse. Legally, her word carried more weight than ours. I called every single night. Most times it went straight to voicemail. When someone picked up, it was either Vanessa with her gentle, exhausted tone. "He's sleeping, Elena. The pain meds knock him out early," or Sophia, who had perfected the art of sounding bored and final. I kept writing it all down in that worn leather notebook. Date, time, duration, exact words spoken, page after page, filled with the same quiet rejections. One cold November evening, I drove up unannounced. The security gate at the end of the long driveway was closed. I entered the old family code. It didn't work. I sat in my car with the heater running, staring at the lights glowing softly in the study window where I knew my father was. I could almost see him sitting in his favorite leather chair, looking out at the dark lake. My chest ached with a kind of emptiness I can't fully describe. If you've ever stood outside your own childhood home, knowing someone you love is inside but unable to reach them, you understand the particular kind of heartbreak I'm talking about. It's not loud. It's heavy. It sits on your ribs and makes every breath feel deliberate. Marcus was struggling even more. He'd show up after teaching, still in his work boots with sawdust on his sleeves, only to be met at the gate with the same polite excuses. Once, Vanessa came out herself, placed a hand on his arm, and said, "Your father needs calm right now, sweetheart. The stress of visitors is too much." The way she said it made it sound like we were the ones hurting him. I started questioning everything. Had I been a distant daughter? Was my work too consuming? Had I not shown up enough in the good years? Those doubts ate at me during long drives home in the dark. But then I'd remember my father's last note, "Keep doing what you do best," and I'd open the notebook again. There were a few small cracks in the wall. One afternoon, I managed to speak with the hospice nurse Claire again. She pulled me aside near her car and spoke quickly, eyes scanning the house behind her. "He's still lucid more often than not. He asks for both of you every day, especially in the mornings." Her voice cracked slightly. "This isn't right, but my hands are tied." Those words kept me going. In mid-December, another envelope arrived in my mailbox. My father's handwriting was shakier this time, but still his. Inside was just one line on his personal stationery: "The quiet preparations matter most. Trust what's already done." Folded with it was a small key, old brass, the kind that opens a filing cabinet. I held it for a long time in my kitchen, turning it over in my fingers. I didn't know what lock it fit yet, but I knew it was important. Flashback memories like that one kept me steady. I remembered being 10 years old, sitting on the floor of his study while he showed me how to organize important documents. "Always have a backup plan on paper, Elena. Words spoken can be twisted. Words written and filed properly cannot." Short memory, he was right. By early January, Dad had slipped into that final decline. I tried one last time. I stood at the front door in the freezing rain, begging through the intercom. Vanessa's voice came through, calm and final. "He's not conscious, Elena. Please respect his peace." The line went dead. He passed at 4:17 a.m. on a Thursday. Vanessa called me at 8:45, her tone flat and businesslike, as if confirming a delivery. By then, she had already arranged everything. The funeral was set for 3 days later. As Marcus and I drove up that morning, the new brass lock on the side door glinted in the weak winter sun. They hadn't just locked us out of his final days. They had changed the locks on our entire history. I sat in the back row of the service with my folder under my arm and my father's challenge coin in my pocket. I didn't know how the reception would unfold, but I could feel the shift inside me. The guilt was slowly turning into something colder and clearer: resolve. Vanessa had played her hand perfectly up to this point. But she had no idea I had been preparing in silence for months. The morning of the funeral felt surreal, like moving through someone else's nightmare in slow motion. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of my car, turning Dad's old challenge coin over and over in his hands. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. The iron gates were open for guests, but everything felt wrong. The house looked the same: gray stone tall windows, the long gravel drive lined with bare maples, yet it already felt like it belonged to someone else. We tried the side door out of habit. The new brass lock stared back at us, shiny and cold. When we walked through the front, the foyer smelled of lilies and expensive perfume instead of the familiar cedar and faint pipe tobacco. Sophia, stood near the entrance handing out cream-colored place cards like a hostess at a gala. She barely met our eyes as she directed us to the back row, behind cousins we hadn't seen in years. The service itself was beautiful in that polished, distant way. Strangers spoke about my father's generosity, his business legacy, his devoted wife who stood by him until the end. Every word felt like another brick in the wall Vanessa had built. I sat there with my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling the weight of the notebook and the folder I'd brought with me. After the burial, everyone returned to the house for the reception. The long dining table was covered with food no one really touched. People milled around in black coats, speaking in that hushed tone reserved for death. I stood by the tall window overlooking the lake, trying to steady my breathing. Then Vanessa tapped her glass. The room fell quiet. She stood at the foot of the grand staircase in her dove-gray dress, looking every bit the grieving widow. One hand rested gracefully on the banister. She thanked everyone for coming, spoke movingly about love and sacrifice, about being the one who stayed. Her voice was perfect, soft, vulnerable, yet strong. Then she delivered the blow. "As many of you know," she said, her eyes scanning the room, "Richard made sure the woman who stood beside him would be cared for. The lake house, the estate, the heart of everything we built together, it now belongs to me." A sympathetic murmur spread through the crowd. Several heads nodded. A great aunt I barely knew leaned over and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Some children only show up when it's convenient." The story had already taken root. Vanessa's gaze found mine across the room. She held it. "I think it's best if Elena and Marcus take some time to process this and leave quietly," she continued, her voice dropping into that gentle, pitying tone. "This is my home now. I hope you understand." Sophia was already moving toward the front door, ready to usher us out. Marcus stood up so fast, his chair scraped loudly against the floor, his face was flushed with grief and anger, I could feel the storm building in him. Before he could speak, I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder and pressed down. Our old signal, he sat. And then, in front of 40 relatives, in the middle of that heavy silence, I laughed. It wasn't loud or mocking, it was soft, almost involuntary, a small breath of disbelief and sudden clarity, but in that quiet room it carried like thunder. Vanessa's perfectly composed face flickered. For the first time I saw genuine surprise in her eyes. If you've ever been publicly erased from your own family story, you know how surreal that moment feels. The pitying stares, the whispers. The way people you've known your whole life suddenly look at you like you're the outsider. I stood slowly, took Marcus's arm and walked us both toward the door. As we passed Vanessa, I looked at her calmly and said nothing. There was nothing left to say in that room. The real conversation would happen somewhere else, in county records offices, in lawyers' conference rooms, and eventually in a courtroom. Outside on the gravel, the cold air hit us hard. Marcus turned to me, voice cracking. "Elena, she just took everything. Why were you smiling?" I looked back at the house my father had poured his life into, the one with the study that still held his scent if you knew where to stand. I squeezed my brother's shoulder and spoke the first truly calm words I'd said in months. Because she just bet everything on a piece of paper she never truly understood. She announced her victory in public without checking the foundation. Now we go prove it. We got in the car and drove away from the only home we'd ever known, but for the first time in 4 months, I didn't feel powerless, I felt focused. Vanessa had spent years building her wall. She had changed the locks, controlled the narrative, and isolated a dying man from his children. She thought fear and paperwork would protect her forever. She had no idea that my father and I had been preparing in silence for over a decade. The real fight was just beginning, and this time I wasn't going to be polite. That drive home from the funeral was quiet, but my mind was anything but. Marcus stared out the window, still processing what had just happened. I kept both hands on the wheel, the leather folder on my lap feeling heavier than it should. Inside it were months of notes, the 2 envelopes from Dad, and the old brass key I still didn't fully understand. The next morning I didn't cry. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the notebook. Page after page of dates, times, excuses, and patterns. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was evidence. If you've ever been backed into a corner by someone who thinks they've already won, you know the moment when something inside you shifts from pain to clarity. That was my moment. I wasn't going to scream or post angry messages or call relatives to argue. I was going to do what I'd been trained to do: document, prepare, and strike with precision. First, I called Tom Reyes, a probate attorney who specialized in contested wills. He listened without interrupting as I laid out the timeline. When I finished, he said something I'll never forget. "Elena, a will can only give away what the deceased actually owned. If your father moved things into a trust years ago, this changes everything." His voice had that calm, experienced tone that told me he'd seen families destroy each other over less. I spent the next week turning pain into preparation. Scanned every page of my notebook into organized digital files. I wrote detailed statements about every time Marcus and I were denied access. I reached out to Claire, the hospice nurse. She agreed to provide a sworn affidavit. Dad was lucid and asked for us daily. Her words carried the weight of a professional who had watched too many families get torn apart. I also started digging into public records. The county recorder's office became my new morning ritual. I requested the full chain of title on the lake house. While I waited for copies, I sat in my car in the parking lot and turned Dad's challenge coin in my fingers, remembering his voice, "The quiet work matters most." One afternoon, I drove back to the house under the pretense of picking up a few personal items the trust might allow. Vanessa wasn't supposed to be there, but she was. I found her in the kitchen surrounded by old papers, past due notices, foreclosure letters from years ago, bank statements covered in red ink. Her hands were shaking as she sorted them. She didn't hear me at first. "Not again," she whispered to herself. "I won't go back to nothing. Not again." For one brief second, I saw the fear that drove her, a woman who had lost everything twice before and was willing to lock out a dying man's children to make sure it never happened a third time. I understood her terror, but understanding didn't mean forgiveness, especially not when she looked up, saw me, and her face hardened again. "Your brother will walk away with nothing," she said coldly. "I'll make sure of it." That was the moment any pity I had left disappeared completely. If you've ever looked into the eyes of someone willing to hurt your family, just to feel safe, you know how it steals your resolve. I left that day with a clearer purpose. This wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about protecting my father's true wishes and clearing his name from the lies she was spreading. Back at home, I opened the filing cabinet in my own study using the small brass key Dad had sent me. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't looked at in years, records from 11 years ago, right after Mom died, when Dad was still healthy and thinking ahead. One folder in particular made my heart stop for a moment. But I didn't rush. I made coffee, sat down and read slowly, because I knew the next steps would require absolute precision, no emotion, just facts. I called Marcus that night and told him we weren't fighting with noise, we were fighting with records. He was angry, grieving, ready to burn bridges. I listened, then reminded him of what Dad always said, measure twice. We had a long road ahead, attorneys, forensic experts, court dates, but for the first time since the locks changed, I slept through the night. Vanessa thought she had won at the funeral. She thought changing the locks and controlling the story would seal her victory. She had no idea I was just getting started. The days after that kitchen confrontation blurred into a focused routine. I woke up early, made strong coffee, and drove to the county recorder's office before most people had finished breakfast. There's something grounding about those beige walls and humming copy machines, places where emotions don't matter, only stamps and dates do. I gave the clerk the parcel number from an old tax bill and asked for the complete chain of title on the lake house. She typed, paused, then printed several pages and slid them across the counter. My hands were steady as I read them, but my heart wasn't. There it was, recorded 11 years earlier, long before Vanessa ever entered our lives. A grant deed transferring the entire property out of my father's personal name and into the Voss family irrevocable trust. The beneficiaries were clearly listed, Marcus and me. The successor trustee? Me. My father had done this quietly, 2 years after losing Mom, when he was still strong and thinking about the future we couldn't yet see. I stood there under the fluorescent lights holding those warm pages, and everything clicked, the note, the coin, the brass key. The quiet preparations matter most. He hadn't been vague. He had been pointing me exactly here. If you've ever discovered that someone you love protected you in ways you never knew while they were alive, you understand the wave of gratitude mixed with fresh grief that hits you. I had to step outside for a moment, breathing in the cold air until the tears stopped threatening. But I didn't stop there. I requested more records, everything related to the business shares, investment accounts, and the holding LLC my father had quietly set up around the same time. The picture grew clearer with every certified copy. Most of the major assets had been moved into protective structures years ago. The will Vanessa was waving around could only touch what little remained outside the trust, and even that was questionable given how it was created. I brought the documents to Tom Reyes the next afternoon. He read them slowly, then looked up at me with new respect in his eyes. Elena, this isn't just a trust. It's airtight. The house was never part of his personal estate. She announced victory over something she never owned. He leaned back. But she's still reaching for everything else, and trying to rewrite who your father was. That's when we started building the bigger case. I turned over every detail I had logged, the forged visitor restriction letter, the timeline of isolation, Claire's affidavit. We subpoenaed the notary journal from Gerald Harrington, the attorney who had helped Vanessa with the new will. When it arrived, the dates didn't match. On the day the journal claimed my father personally appeared to sign, Claire's medical notes showed he had been heavily sedated and unresponsive. 2 official documents, both with stamps and signatures, telling completely different stories. We also hired a forensic document examiner. Patricia had been doing this for 30 years. She compared the signature on Vanessa's will against dozens of my father's known documents, the trust deed, old contracts, even the handwritten notes he sent me. Her report was clinical but devastating. The will signature showed classic signs of simulation, tremor. In the wrong places, pressure patterns that didn't match, pen lifts where my father never lifted. Someone had traced and copied his hand while he lay dying. If you've ever had proof handed to you that someone deliberately hurt your family, you know the strange calm that follows the initial shock, not rage, just cold, clear purpose. Marcus came over one evening while I was organizing everything. He looked exhausted, the kind of tired that grief and uncertainty carve into a person. Elena, what if we just let her have most of it? I don't even want the fight anymore. I placed the certified trust deed and Dad's last note on the table between us. I reminded him how Dad asked for us every day, how the locks were changed before he was even buried. How the story being told about our father, that he chose her over his own children, was a lie carved into public record. This stopped being about the money months ago, I told him quietly. This is about who Dad really was, and we're not letting her bury that truth. He picked up the note, read it again, and nodded slowly. The same determined nod he used to give before stepping onto the wrestling mat in high school. We were no longer just reacting, we were preparing to walk into that courtroom with a file so complete that truth itself would do most of the talking. Vanessa thought her expensive lawyer and dramatic funeral speech had ended the story. She had no idea we were about to show the county, and everyone who ever believed her, the real one. The deeper I dug, the more the full picture came into focus. Not just a simple will contest, but a carefully orchestrated plan that had been years in the making. Tom and I spent long afternoons in his office spreading documents across the conference table like a war map. The trust deed was ironclad, but Vanessa's will reached for everything else. The company shares that hadn't been fully transferred, investment accounts, even personal items that held sentimental value. What truly stunned me was how she had tried to cover her tracks. During discovery, we uncovered something that made my stomach turn. Phone records subpoenaed from the hospice period showed several outgoing calls from my father's cell phone to me and Marcus, calls we had never received. When we dug further, forensic audio analysis revealed they were deepfake voice messages. Someone had used old recordings of Dad's voice, stitched together with AI tools, to create messages saying he didn't want visitors and was at peace with his new family. Vanessa hadn't just locked the physical doors, she had tried to lock us out of his voice too. If you've ever been manipulated by technology in the most personal way possible, hearing what sounds like your dying parent rejecting you, you understand the fresh layer of betrayal that adds. It made the isolation feel even more cruel, more calculated. But the biggest twist came from an old external hard drive I found using that small brass key in Dad's hidden filing cabinet at home. It contained scanned copies of every major document from 11 years ago, plus something I hadn't expected, a video recording. In it, my father sat in his study, looking healthy and clear-eyed, speaking directly to the camera. "I'm setting this up while I still can," he said, his voice steady. "If anything happens to me, the Voss Family Trust and the Holding LLC protect what matters most, my children. Elena, you're the trustee for a reason. You've always understood the quiet work. Don't let anyone rewrite our story." He had recorded it 2 months after signing the trust documents, right around the time Vanessa first appeared in his life. He must have sensed something, even then. Or perhaps he was simply being the careful man he always was. I watched that video 3 times in a row, sitting alone in my living room with tears running silently down my face, not broken tears, tears of recognition. He had seen the risk and quietly protected us anyway. This changed the entire strategy. Tom filed an amended complaint that included not only undue influence and forgery, but also evidence of digital manipulation and intentional isolation using fraudulent means. The forged doctor's note restricting visitors was now just one piece in a larger pattern of deceit. Patricia, the forensic examiner, delivered her final report the following week. The will signature wasn't just simulated, it showed clear signs of being traced from a model document while Dad was medicated. Combined with the notary journal and hospice records, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Gerald Harrington, Vanessa's attorney, had drafted the will, notarized it himself, and named himself executor with a substantial fee. The conflict of interest was glaring. In our state, that shifted the burden of proof onto them. Marcus and I sat together one evening reviewing the growing file. The weight of what we had built felt both heavy and liberating. "She really thought she could erase us," he said quietly. "She almost did," I replied, "but Dad made sure she couldn't." If you've ever had to fight not just for what you inherit but for the memory of who your parent really was, you know how personal this becomes. This was never about millions of dollars. It was about refusing to let a calculated fear rewrite my father's legacy. We were no longer hoping for justice. We were walking into that courtroom armed with undeniable truth, timestamps, stamps, signatures, audio forensics, and a video from beyond the grave. Vanessa had spent 4 months building her fortress of lies. We had spent 11 years unknowingly building the foundation that would outlast it. The hearing was 3 weeks away, and for the first time I felt completely at peace with whatever came next. Because the paperwork, the quiet work my father had trusted me with, was finally ready to speak. The weeks leading up to the hearing became a masterclass in turning grief into strategy. I treated the case like the intelligence operations I ran in the Army. Every piece of evidence had to be cross-checked, every timeline verified, every weakness anticipated. There was no room for emotion in the preparation, only in the quiet moments afterward when I allowed myself to feel. Tom Reyes and I met almost daily. We organized the file into a clean, logical sequence that would tell the story without drama. First, the certified trust deed from 11 years ago, proving the lake house and major assets had never belonged to my father's personal estate. Second, the notary journal sitting side by side with Claire's hospice records showing my father was sedated and unresponsive on the exact day he supposedly signed the new will. Third, Patricia's forensic report, detailing how the signature had been carefully simulated. Fourth, the oncologist's sworn statement confirming the visitor restriction letter was forged. And finally, the video from my father, that calm, clear message from the past. Each document was like a brick. Together they built a wall Vanessa could not climb. If you've ever had to prepare for a fight where the stakes are your family's truth, you know how exhausting and clarifying it feels. I barely slept. I would wake at 3 a.m., review notes, then go for a run around the lake near my apartment just to clear my head. Marcus came over most evenings. We didn't talk much about feeling. Instead, we reviewed timelines together, practiced staying calm under pressure. He was still raw, but I watched him grow steadier with every passing day. One afternoon, Tom looked across the table and said, "Elena, most families fold under pressure like this. The legal bills, the family pressure, the uncertainty. You're doing something different." I just nodded. I wasn't doing it for praise. I was doing it because my father had trusted me with the quiet work, and I refused to let him down. Vanessa, meanwhile, was playing her own game. Through Gerald Harrington, she sent a settlement offer, split the contested assets down the middle, no trial. Just a confidentiality agreement that would keep the forgery and isolation hidden forever. On paper, it looked generous. Tom laid it out plainly. Trials are unpredictable, money is real, peace might be worth it. I thought about it for one long night. I imagined signing that agreement, agreeing to let her version of my father's story stand as the official record. Agreeing never to speak about the locked doors, the deepfake calls, the way she had isolated a dying man from his children. The next morning I told Tom, no, we go to hearing. The truth doesn't get buried with a signature. If you've ever had to choose between money and the truth about someone you love, you understand how heavy that decision is. I didn't want more than my father intended. I wanted the record to reflect who he really was, a man who protected his children even when he couldn't speak. We prepared for every possible angle. I practiced speaking in front of the mirror, keeping my voice level, my facts clear, my emotions controlled, no tears in the courtroom, no raised voices. Just the steady strength my father had taught me. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my study with Dad's challenge coin in one hand and the trust deed in the other. I whispered to the empty room, "I kept the paperwork, Dad, just like you asked." Marcus texted me at midnight, "Whatever happens tomorrow, we already won by not giving up." For the first time in months, I smiled without effort. The next morning, I wore my good coat, the same one I'd worn to the funeral. I carried only a thin leather folder. The person with the biggest stack of paper is usually the one bluffing. I wasn't bluffing. We arrived early at the small wood-paneled probate courtroom. The smell of old varnish and radiator heat felt strangely comforting. Claire, the hospice nurse, showed up in her cardigan and gave me a small, supportive nod. Marcus sat beside me, steady, Dad's coin in his closed fist. Then Vanessa arrived. She moved through the room like she still owned it. Black dress, pearls, head high. Sophia trailed behind her. Gerald Harrington looked nervous, constantly adjusting his tie. When the clerk handed our exhibit list to their table, I watched Gerald's face lose color as he read through it. He leaned over and whispered urgently to Vanessa. For the first time, I saw real fear cross her perfectly composed features. The judge entered. We all stood. I rested my hand on the thin folder and felt something close to peace underneath the grief. The papers were in order. The truth was ready. This was no longer her story. It was about to become the official record. The hearing began with a heavy silence that pressed against the wood-paneled walls. Vanessa's side went first. Gerald Harrington stood confidently at the podium, presenting the will as if it were unquestionable. His voice was smooth, practiced. He spoke of a devoted wife who had cared for my father in his final months, of a man who had chosen to reward the person who stayed. He used the word valid multiple times, like a shield. Vanessa sat with perfect posture, occasionally dabbing her eyes with a tissue for effect. Then it was our turn. Tom didn't raise his voice or make dramatic speeches. He simply began laying the documents on the table one by one, walking the judge through them with quiet precision. He started with the certified grant deed recorded 11 years earlier. Line by line, he showed how the lake house and major assets had been transferred into the Voss family irrevocable trust. The beneficiaries were Marcus and me. I was named successor trustee. The county stamp and date predated Vanessa's marriage by several years. Your Honor, Tom said calmly, a will can only distribute what the decedent personally owned at the time of death. The centerpiece of this will, the mansion, was never part of the estate. I watched Vanessa shift in her seat. Her eyes widened slightly. She started to rise, but Gerald put a hand on her arm. The room felt smaller. Tom continued without pause. He placed the notary journal beside Claire's hospice records. The dates aligned perfectly and contradicted each other completely. On the day the will was supposedly signed, my father had been heavily sedated and unresponsive. Claire took the stand next. In her simple cardigan, she spoke plainly under oath. My father had asked for his children every single day. His mind remained clear far longer than people realized. On that specific Tuesday, there was no way he could have left the house or signed legal documents. Gerald's face had gone pale. Next came Patricia, the forensic document examiner. With 30 years of quiet authority, she explained the simulated signature on the will, the tremors, the pen lifts, the pressure patterns that didn't match any of my father's authentic documents. In my professional opinion, she said, this signature was not written by Richard Voss. The final brick was the oncologist's statement confirming the visitor restriction letter taped to our door had also been forged. I spoke only twice during the entire hearing. The first time was after the trust deed was presented. I looked directly at Vanessa and said, voice steady and clear, you stood at my father's funeral and told everyone the house was never really ours. You were right. It was already ours, years before you arrived. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, when Gerald had no real answers left, I spoke again. You told me I couldn't afford this fight. You were wrong. I didn't need to outspend you. I only needed to tell the truth my father prepared for and trusted me to protect. Vanessa broke. She shot up from her chair, composure shattering completely. Her voice rose, trembling with anger and desperation. She spoke about how she had nursed my father, sacrificed everything, while his own children were absent. Sophia started crying loudly behind her. The judge called for order, but Vanessa kept going, pointing at me, accusing me of trying to steal from a grieving widow. I didn't interrupt, I didn't raise my voice. When she finally ran out of words and the room fell quiet again, I simply laid out the facts one last time, the changed locks, the deepfake calls, the isolation, the fear that drove her to hurt a dying man's family, not with accusation but with the steady weight of truth. The more she shouted, the smaller she became. The judge ruled from the bench. The will was denied admission to probate. The estate would pass according to the trust and intestate succession to my father's children. Gerald Harrington's conduct was referred to the state bar, and evidence of forgery was forwarded to the district attorney. Vanessa sat down hard as if the air had been pulled from the room. If you've ever watched justice unfold not with dramatic yelling, but with quiet, undeniable facts, you know how powerful that moment feels. It wasn't loud triumph. It was a deep, steady release, like finally setting down a weight you'd carried for far too long. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand. His eyes were wet, but he was smiling for the first time in months. Claire gave me a small nod from across the room. The cousins who had come to watch left without meeting our eyes. Outside in the marble hallway, the grandfather clock from my childhood wasn't there, but I swear I could still hear it ticking, patient, steady, and finally striking the hour my father had prepared for years ago. Vanessa walked past us on her way out, smaller somehow, Sophia holding her arm. I stopped her gently. My voice carried no heat, only finality. The keys, I said. You can hand them back now. She didn't reply, she just kept walking. In that moment, I understood something important. Real victory isn't loud. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing you honored the truth when it mattered most. The courtroom emptied slowly, like the tide pulling back after a storm. Marcus and I sat for a few extra moments after the judge left, neither of us quite ready to move. The weight that had pressed on my chest for nearly a year felt lighter, but not gone. Justice doesn't erase the pain of what was lost, it simply makes it bearable. Outside in the wide marble hallway, the reality started to settle. The will was dead. The trust stood exactly as my father had designed it 11 years earlier. The lake house, the core of the estate, and most of the company's shares would pass to us. Gerald Harrington faced serious professional consequences, and the district attorney's office had been notified about the forgeries and digital manipulation. Vanessa lost far more than money that day. She lost the story she had spent years crafting, the one where she was the devoted savior and we were the ungrateful children. The public record now told the truth, and in a county as connected as ours, that truth traveled fast. If you've ever won a fight you didn't want to be in, you know it doesn't feel like fireworks and celebration. It feels like exhaustion mixed with a deep, quiet relief. I didn't jump or cheer. I just held my brother while he shook with emotions he'd been carrying since the day the doors first locked. We drove back to the house the following week with legal documents in hand. The new brass lock that had once kept us out now turned easily with the keys returned through Tom's office. I used the side door, the family door, out of habit. The moment it swung open, the familiar scent of cedar and old books hit me, faint but still there underneath the vanilla candles Vanessa had filled the place with. We spent that first afternoon quietly reclaiming the space. Marcus and I opened every window in the study. We removed the thick scented candles, the new throw pillows, and the carefully staged photographs that had replaced our family pictures. Slowly, the house started breathing again. The real smell of home, Dad's pipe tobacco memory, the old books, the lake air began to return. Vanessa had already moved out by then. She left the county quietly before winter fully arrived. I heard through distant relatives that she and Sophia had gone somewhere south. I didn't follow up. Some doors, once chained against you, don't need to be slammed shut. You simply stop walking through them. The relatives who had whispered about us at the funeral started reaching out with awkward apologies. I accepted them politely but didn't invest much energy there. The ones who truly mattered, the few who had questioned the story early, we welcomed back slowly. Marcus especially needed time. The betrayal had cut him deeper because he had tried so hard to stay close until the very end. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, Marcus and I sat in Dad's old leather chairs in the study. He turned the challenge coin in his hand and said softly, "She almost succeeded, didn't she?" "She did a lot of damage," I replied, "but she couldn't touch what Dad protected years before she arrived. That's the part she never understood." If you've ever had to fight to protect a parent's true legacy after they're gone, you know this kind of victory carries both sweetness and sorrow. We didn't get Dad back. We didn't undo the months of isolation, but we made sure his final wishes and his love for us could never be erased. The legal aftermath continued for months. Accounts were transferred, shares restructured, and Gerald lost his license to practice. But the real healing wasn't in the paperwork anymore. It was in what we chose to do next with the house my father had so carefully safeguarded. The months that followed the hearing were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations or victory parties, just the slow, steady work of healing and rebuilding. Marcus and I decided together what to do with the lake house. We weren't going to live there as a monument to pain or a symbol of what we had to fight for. My father had always said a house isn't bricks, it's the people who fill it with purpose. So we turned the entire estate into the Voss Legacy Center, a community space for veterans transitioning back to civilian life and single-parent families who need a safe place to land. We kept the study exactly as Dad loved it. The old books, the leather chair, the faint scent of cedar that finally came back once the windows stayed open long enough. The grand rooms now host workshops, counseling sessions, and weekend gatherings. Children run through the halls where we once walked carefully as kids. Veterans sit on the back porch overlooking the lake, sharing stories the way Dad used to share his. If you've ever taken something painful and turned it into something that helps others, you know the deep kind of peace that brings. It doesn't erase the locked doors or the months we lost with our father, but it honors him in the way he would have wanted most, by helping people who feel unseen, the same way we once felt erased. I forgave myself somewhere along the way. Late one night, sitting alone in the study with Dad's challenge coin in my hand, I finally let go of the guilt I'd carried for being too patient, too polite. I hadn't failed him. I had simply needed time to find the path he had quietly prepared for me years earlier, the paperwork, the trust, the video, the lessons he taught when I was young. Vanessa's fear had driven her to terrible choices. I understood the root of it, the terror of losing everything again, but understanding never excused the harm she caused. Some people let their pain make them gentle. Others let it make them ruthless. She chose the latter, and it cost her more than any courtroom could take away. Marcus is doing better now. He still teaches shop at the high school, but he also runs woodworking programs at the center on weekends. We talk more openly these days. The fight brought us closer in ways the easy years never could. If you've ever been locked out of someone's life, whether by a step-parent, a partner, or even your own doubts, I hope this story stays with you. Keep the paperwork. Document the truth while you still can. Protect what matters most with more than words, with records that outlast fear and lies, and most importantly, trust the quiet work. It speaks louder than any dramatic speech or locked door. To everyone watching who has felt erased from their own family, you are not alone. Type "I kept the paperwork" in the comments if this story reminded you to protect your own legacy. Or type "trust" if you believe the truth eventually finds its way. My father couldn't control who stood at his door in the end, but years earlier, while he was strong and clear, he made sure the truth could never be locked away. That's the greatest gift he left us. And now, thanks to him, the house that was almost taken from us belongs to everyone who needs it. Thank you for sitting with me through this. If it moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. This is my story, 1 year of locked doors, 11 years of quiet protection, and a legacy that finally feels right again.